In the fall of 1865, somewhere high in the granite walls of the Sierra Nevada, a Chinese laborer was lowered over the face of a cliff in a woven reed basket. He was one of thousands. The basket hung from a rope held by men he could not see, standing on a ledge 1,000 feet above the American River. The laborer carried a hand drill, a hammer, and a charge of black powder. His job was to chip a hole into the vertical rock face, pack the hole with explosive, light the fuse, and signal the men above to haul him up before the blast went off. If they pulled fast enough, he lived. If they did not, he fell, or the blast caught him, and his body dropped into the canyon below, and the next man went over the side. This was how America built its first transcontinental railroad. Not with machines, not with engineering marvels, with human beings hanging from ropes on the face of a mountain, drilling holes in granite by hand, lighting fuses, and hoping they would be pulled to safety before the rock exploded beneath them. The Central Pacific Railroad officially reported 137 deaths during 4 years of construction. In 1870, 1 year after the railroad was completed, a journalist saw a train loaded with the bones of an estimated 1,200 Chinese workers being shipped home for burial. The actual death toll was never recorded because the men who died were not considered important enough to count. The Transcontinental Railroad was authorized by Congress in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, as an act of national will. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act on July 1st, 1862, granting 2 companies the right to build a railroad from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. The Union Pacific Railroad would build westward from Council Bluffs, Iowa, near Omaha. The Central Pacific Railroad would build eastward from Sacramento, California. The 2 lines would meet somewhere in the middle, and when they did, the continent would be connected by rail for the first time. The journey from New York to San Francisco, which took 6 months by wagon or ship, would take 6 days. The government offered both companies a package of incentives so extravagant it amounted to a license to print money. Federal land grants of 6,400 acres were given for every mile of track laid, and government bonds were issued, $16,000 per mile on flat ground, $32,000 per mile in the high desert, and $48,000 per mile through the mountains. The more miles you built, the more land and money you received. The result was a race. 2 companies, building from opposite ends of the continent, competed to lay the most track as fast as possible, because every mile of rail was worth a fortune. The men who ran these companies understood this arithmetic perfectly. Thomas Durant, the vice president of the Union Pacific, created a shell construction company called Credit Mobilier of America that contracted with the Union Pacific to build the railroad at massively inflated prices. The railroad paid Credit Mobilier. Credit Mobilier paid its shareholders, who were the same men who ran the Union Pacific. The profit skimmed off the construction budget was staggering. When the scandal eventually broke in 1872, it implicated 2 vice presidents of the United States and more than a dozen members of Congress who had received shares in Credit Mobilier as bribes. The men who built the railroad with their hands received $2 a day. The men who built it with their signatures received millions. Speed was everything. Safety was nothing. The men who did the work were expendable. There were always more. The Union Pacific had the easier terrain and the harder workforce problem. The route from Omaha westward crossed the Great Plains, flat prairie that stretched to the horizon, where a man could see for miles in every direction, and the biggest engineering challenge was bridging the rivers. The work was grading and track laying, repetitive and brutal, but not technically complex. But there were exceptions. The Dale Creek Bridge in Wyoming, 4 miles west of Sherman Summit, at the highest point on the entire transcontinental route, was 700 feet long and 126 feet above the streambed. The original bridge was built entirely of wood, prefabricated in Chicago and shipped to Wyoming. It was so flimsy and the site so exposed to wind that engineers crossed it at 4 miles per hour, holding their breath, praying the gusts would not catch the train broadside and send it into the gorge. The Loup Fork Bridge in Nebraska was 1,500 feet long. These structures were built by hand by men working above canyons and rivers with no safety equipment, no harnesses, no nets. They fell. They fell from the bridges they were building, from the trestles they were erecting, from the scaffolding they stood on while driving bolts into timber. Nobody counted them either. The labor force was a volatile mix of Irish immigrants fresh off the boat, Civil War veterans from both sides who had nothing to go home to, and freed black men looking for paying work in the West. They were paid roughly $2 a day, and they earned it. Each mile of track required 2,500 wooden ties laid on a graded roadbed, 400 steel rails spiked to those ties, 10 spikes per rail, 3 hammer blows per spike. 4-man crews worked in synchronized rhythm, laying 4 rails per minute, a reporter comparing the sound to a grand anvil chorus echoing across the empty prairie. The men lived in rolling bunkhouses that General Jack Casement, the Union Pacific's construction boss, had built on flat cars that moved with the railhead. They ate beef, bread, and black coffee. They drank whiskey when they could get it, which was often, because the hell-on-wheels towns followed the railroad like vultures following a herd. Every time the railhead moved forward, a temporary city of canvas tents and rough-cut lumber sprouted at the end of the track. Saloons, gambling houses, brothels, and general stores, all of them designed to separate the workers from their wages before the next payday. Vice and crime stalked unblushingly in the midday sun, one rail boss wrote to his wife from the end of track. The towns had names like Julesburg, Cheyenne, Laramie, and they were lawless in ways that made the frontier look civilized. But the real danger on the Union Pacific was not the whiskey or the gambling. It was the land the railroad was being built across. The Great Plains were not empty. They were home to the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and other nations whose ancestral territory the railroad was cutting through without their consent and without meaningful negotiation. The small survey parties that scouted ahead of the construction crews to locate the roadbed did not always come back. There were raids, sniper attacks, livestock thefts, scalpings, and burnings along the entire right-of-way. The massacre of 81 soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny in December 1866 convinced many workers that there were better ways to earn a living, and the Union Pacific struggled with desertion rates that sometimes exceeded the rate at which new workers could be hired. The company responded by arming the work crews and requesting cavalry escorts from the U.S. Army, turning the construction project into a military operation in everything but name. The railroad was not just being built through native land. It was being built as an instrument of conquest, and everyone involved knew it. The track attracted settlers. The settlers killed the buffalo. The buffalo had sustained the Plains nations for thousands of years. By the time the railroad was finished, the herds were already in catastrophic decline. Within 2 decades, they would be nearly extinct, and the peoples who depended on them would be confined to reservations. The railroad would carry cattle and wheat across the land where the buffalo had grazed, and nobody in the government or the railroad companies would acknowledge that this had been the plan all along. The Central Pacific had the opposite problem. The terrain was a nightmare, and the workforce was non-existent. The route from Sacramento eastward climbed from 30 feet above sea level to over 7,000 feet in 100 miles, straight up the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, through granite so hard that blasting barely dented it, across canyons so deep that bridges had to be built hundreds of feet above the valley floor, and through mountain passes where the snow fell 40 feet deep in winter and did not melt until June. The company needed thousands of men willing to do this work. And in early 1865, when the Central Pacific advertised for 5,000 laborers, a few hundred white men showed up. Most of them quit within weeks. The work was too hard, the conditions too miserable, and the gold fields and farmland of California offered easier money. Charles Crocker, the Central Pacific's construction superintendent, faced a crisis. He could not build a railroad without workers. In desperation, he proposed hiring Chinese immigrants, of whom there were thousands in California, most of them former gold miners who had been driven out of the camps by racist violence and discriminatory taxes. His foreman, James Harvey Strobridge, objected. He did not believe the Chinese were physically capable of the work. Crocker overruled him and hired 50 Chinese men as an experiment. They proved to be the most disciplined, reliable, and hard-working laborers the Central Pacific had ever employed. Within months, the company was recruiting directly from the Guangdong province of China, and by 1867, Chinese workers made up 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce, between 10,000 and 15,000 men at any given time. They were paid 30 to 50% less than white workers. They received roughly $26 to $35 a month, while white workers received the same amount, plus room and board. The Chinese workers were expected to provide their own food, their own tools, and their own shelter. They cooked their own meals, subsisting primarily on rice, dried fish, and vegetables, which they purchased from Chinese merchants who followed the construction camps. They boiled their water for tea, a practice that inadvertently saved them from the dysentery and waterborne diseases that regularly struck down the Irish workers, who drank unboiled water from streams and rivers. The Chinese were rarely drunk. They worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for prisoners. And the company treated them not as employees deserving of protection, but as a resource to be consumed and replaced. The Sierra Nevada was where the consumption happened. In the summer of 1865, the Central Pacific reached Cape Horn, a sheer granite promontory jutting over the American River, 1,300 feet above the canyon floor. The roadbed had to be carved into the face of the cliff, a ledge at least 8 feet wide, blasted and chipped out of vertical rock. The Chinese workers did this by hand. They were lowered over the edge in woven baskets or on ropes, swinging against the rock face, drilling holes with hand steel, packing the holes with black powder, lighting the fuses, and then shouting to be pulled up. The work took 6 months. Men died. Some were not pulled up fast enough after lighting fuses. Some were hit by flying rock from blasts above or below them. Some fell when ropes frayed or baskets broke. The exact number is unknown, because no one kept records of Chinese casualties. Then came the tunnels. There were 15 of them, totaling over 6,000 feet, bored through the solid granite spine of the Sierra Nevada at elevations above 7,000 feet. The sixth tunnel, called Summit Tunnel, was the worst. It was 1,695 feet long and 124 feet below the surface of the mountain. The granite was so hard that crews working with hand drills and black powder advanced only 8 inches per day. To speed progress, the company sank a vertical shaft 72 feet from the top of the mountain to the midpoint of the tunnel, lowered men down the shaft, and had them dig outward in both directions, giving the tunnel 4 working faces instead of 2. The air at the bottom of the shaft was foul. The light was dim. The men worked in shifts around the clock every day for over a year. When black powder proved too slow, the company brought in nitroglycerin, a liquid explosive 13 times more powerful than black powder and so unstable that transporting it was illegal. A Scottish chemist named James Howden mixed it on site from raw chemicals. Nitroglycerin detonated at temperatures approaching 5,000 degrees Celsius, nearly as hot as the surface of the sun. It could explode from a bump, a drop, or a temperature change. Howden received hazard pay. He eventually turned to drink, and the job of mixing the explosive was handed to the Chinese workers. The Irish would not touch it. Men died in premature detonations. Men died when charges failed to go off and then exploded as they returned to check them. Men died when the mountain itself rejected what they were doing to it and shook loose rock that buried them where they stood. The winter of 1866 to 1867 was one of the worst on record. More than 40 feet of snow fell on the Sierra. The Chinese workers lived in tunnels they had dug through the snow from their camps to the tunnel work faces, emerging into daylight only on the rare clear days. Their shacks were buried so deep that only the chimneys were visible above the snowpack. Avalanches swept through the camps without warning. Entire work gangs disappeared. Their bodies were not found until spring, when the snow melted and revealed them frozen in the positions they had been in when the slide hit, some still holding their tools. No one knows how many men were killed in the avalanches of that winter. The Central Pacific did not count them. The company counted miles of track and cubic yards of granite removed and dollars of government bonds earned. The men who did the work were an expense line, not a casualty report. On June 25, 1867, approximately 3,000 Chinese workers in the Sierra Nevada put down their tools and stopped working. It was the largest labor strike in American history to that date. They demanded equal pay with white workers, shorter shifts in the tunnels, and a 10-hour workday instead of 11. They demanded the right not to be whipped by overseers, which tells you something about what the working conditions were actually like. The strike was non-violent. The men returned to their camps and waited. Charles Crocker broke the strike by cutting off their food supply. The Chinese workers were isolated in the high mountains, dependent on supply trains controlled by the company. After 8 days without food, they went back to work. Their wages were not increased. Their hours were not reduced. The strike was never mentioned in the company's official records. By the summer of 1868, the Central Pacific had broken through the Sierra Nevada and entered the flat desert of Nevada and Utah. The terrain was easier, but the conditions were not. The first 40 miles east of the mountains were pure desert, with no water and no inhabitants. Summer temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers collapsed from heat stroke and dehydration. The company's engineers discovered fresh water springs inside mountains flanking the railroad line and ran pipes and storage tanks along the route to keep the men alive. Charles Crocker authorized a hot-season pay raise for all workers, including the Chinese, not out of generosity, but because the men were dying faster than they could be replaced and the railroad needed to keep moving. The construction pace accelerated as the two railroads approached each other, each company desperate to lay as many miles as possible before the meeting point was fixed. The competition became so absurd that at one point the two companies were grading parallel roadbeds past each other in opposite directions, each one refusing to stop and concede the meeting point because stopping meant forfeiting miles, and miles meant money. Newly elected President Ulysses Grant finally intervened and told both companies that the government would withhold funding if they could not agree on where to meet. They settled on Promontory Summit, Utah. In the final push, the Central Pacific's Chinese crews set a record that has never been equaled. 10 miles of track were laid in 12 hours by hand, 4 rails per minute, 21 million hammer swings in a single day. The newspapers in the United States and Europe covered the great race as front-page news. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the two railroads met. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific and founder of the university that bears his name, tapped a ceremonial golden spike with a silver hammer, and a one-word telegraph was sent across the nation, the word done. The 6-month continental journey was now a 6-day train ride. The crowd cheered, the band played, photographs were taken of the locomotives facing each other, their cowcatchers nearly touching, surrounded by men in suits and top hats. The Chinese workers who had built the western half of the railroad were not in the photographs. They were not invited to the ceremony. They had been pulled off the line weeks earlier, replaced by Mormon crews for the final stretch into Utah. After the ceremony, 25,000 Chinese and Irish laborers were unemployed. The Chinese dispersed across the West, finding work in laundries and restaurants and lumber mills and fishing villages, building the Chinatowns that would become targets of the racial violence that followed. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning Chinese immigration to the United States for the next 60 years. The men who had blasted through the Sierra Nevada, who had hung from baskets on the face of Cape Horn, who had mixed nitroglycerin with their bare hands and bored through granite by candlelight and survived avalanches and strikes and exploitation, and a winter that tried to bury them alive. We're told they were no longer welcome in the country they had built. The Transcontinental Railroad transformed the United States. It cut the continent in half and stitched it back together with steel. It opened the West to settlement, agriculture, and industry on a scale that would have been impossible without it. It generated fortunes for the men who financed it and poverty for many of the men who built it. It destroyed the buffalo herds that had sustained the Plains nations for millennia and accelerated the confinement of those nations to reservations. It carried settlers west and crops east and manufactured goods in every direction, and it created the infrastructure on which the American industrial economy of the 20th century was built. And it was built by hand, by men who were paid almost nothing, who were worked until they broke, who died in explosions and avalanches and heat and cold, whose bones were shipped home in boxcars, and whose names were never recorded because nobody thought to write them down. The golden spike is in a museum. The bones are in the ground. The railroad they built still runs. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them was built on the backs of people the history books forgot.